Okay, Shavua Tov. Yeah, just leave them here so if anybody else needs. Okay, it's really, really good to be back. Uh, Thank you. That's kind. Okay, it's nice to travel, but it's better to come home. I'm not one of the great travelers. But the poem that we're doing today is not one of the poems that I would have put in. I mean, we still have poems from Kabbalat Shabbat and from Shachrit on Shabbat. We still have some poems, Tehillim, that are regular in the Siddur. And I'm sort of jumping the line to do this one, number 107. And the reason is, it's sort of sad, actually. I mean, but as the Shem will end up being good, one of my wife's relatives is very sick. And so the family distributed amongst the broad family Tehillim to recite. And the one that I got was 107. And so I've been saying it every day and saying it every day. I've sort of like gotten used to it. And I decided I'd like to share some of, I don't like just to read, Tehillim, especially poetry in general, but especially Tehillim. I like to try to think about it. And so I've been thinking about the poem. And so I just want to share some of my thoughts and actually share something that goes back to my youth. Before I was Dati, I knew of this poem in verse 23, Chav Gimel. It says, Yordei Hayam Ba'aniyot, those that go down to the sea in ships. Now, this is a very famous line, and there are songs, especially in England. There are a number of songs because England was always famous for their navy. So a lot of churches sing songs based on this. But I grew up. I hope you can see it. I don't know. With there's a picture of the Fisherman Memorial in Gloucester, Mass, just north of Boston, and on it's a fisherman with his slicker on and his rain hat for this ocean spray and whatever, and at the wheel of the ship and it says on it, they that go down to the sea in ships. 1623, which is when Gloucester was first settled, to 1923, when 100 years ago almost, when the statue was put up. When I was a kid, we sometimes went for the blessing of the fleet, and it was a little embarrassing. The Archbishop of Boston would, I remember when I was a kid, it was Cardinal Cushing, would recite these blessings on the fleet. It was, and there were fireworks. It was, it was very, there was a parade. It was like a big deal. And the centerpiece of his blessing was always this verse from our psalm. And so, as soon as I started reading it, on a daily basis, it's like I had this connection to my youth in the in as well. About, I don't know, I'm going to say 10 meters or so from this monument is the listing of all the names of all of the fishermen from Gloucester who lost their lives in over the hundreds of years that it's been a fishing port. And the most famous of them, I don't know if you saw the movie. I'm not even going to suggest you see it because it's really difficult, especially at the end, called The Perfect Storm. And that was about a fishing boat from Gloucester that went out and was caught in the storm, and there were no survivors. So then, sorry? I'm going to say 10, 12 years ago. Yeah. It's a relatively new movie. Right. Yeah, it's a relatively new movie, and it was sort of hard to watch. But I mean, growing up in that area and being part of that culture, it was a big deal. It was indeed a big deal to us. So anyways, so that's in the poem. But the poem is famous for a number of other reasons. The most famous reason why this poem is famous, if you look on the second sheet on the back, it's because of this Gemara. The Gemara, as you can see from Brachot, Masechet Brachot, Nun Dalid, Amid Bet, Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Arba Tzrichim Lahodot. There are 4 people that have to give thanks to Hashem. Yordei Hayam, those who go down to the sea and survive. Holchei Midbarot, those who walk in the deserts. Okay, Misha Haya Cholev v'nitrapeh, someone who was very ill and was cured, was nursed back to health. Umisha Haya Chavush b'beit asurim v'yatza. Okay, and those who were imprisoned and got out. Then it starts to go Yordiyam. Then it starts quoting the psukim from our psalm. What is the thanks that they say to Hashem? Birchat HaGomel. This is the source for benching Gomel, for when people in shul. And the Gemara goes on to say that the original minhag was those people, and we're going to see this in the poem. These people were expected to bring a korban todah, a thanksgiving sacrifice offering in the temple. And nowadays, because we don't have the Beit HaMikdash, l'tza'arenu harav, we instead say the bracha in a minyan. This is not a halacha shir, so I don't want to go through all of the ramifications of it, but we'll see more about these 4 and why these 4 is what we're going to be talking about very soon. But there's the big argument about benching Gomel has to do with women. So I just want to quickly mention that it is indeed a machloket, that there is a deya. The Gemara says that a husband can say on behalf of a wife, but the Gemara never says that a woman can't say it. I think that it was just over the years, women felt uncomfortable, reciting something in public. But I believe strongly, and the Gemara doesn't say you can't, is that if a woman feels comfortable doing it, it's perfectly okay and wonderful for a woman to bench Gomel in Beit Knesset. But of course, everybody goes according to their minhag and the minhag of Yeshul. So this is the source for that. There are 2 major problems in the poem. The first problem in the poem is, what are the circumstances about which David HaMelech, we believe, wrote this poem, although we're going to see another opinion in a minute. What were the circumstances around which he wrote the poem? And there are 5 with a 6th coming on later, opinions about when you recite this poem, what it was talking about. Okay, so we'll get into that in a minute. The other problem is the famous problem about schar v'onesh, reward and punishment. So that philosophic argument is later in the poem, and we're going to do that next week. But I just want to begin now by giving the different opinions about why this poem was written, or concerning what issues this poem was written. The first one, and the most popular amongst the Meforshim, the Radak and the Lead and the Malbim agrees, is it's a universal poem. It's not talking specifically about the Jewish nation. And it is a poem about thanking God for being rescued from adversity. And that has nothing to do with being Jewish. It's just about that major issue, which is a beautiful idea. And we know, especially in the Second Temple, especially after Herod, Hordus, rebuilt the temple, we know a tremendous number of non-Jews brought sacrifices, brought korbanot. It's at some point in the 1st century, apparently the majority of the personal private offerings that were brought were from Gentiles. So this idea fits, and that's fine. However, there are a large number of Meforshim that, especially more mystical ones, and I'll end with the Besh in a minute, who feel this poem is talking about Jewish history. And even though the nation, Yisrael, or Bnei Yaakov, is not mentioned in the poem at all, there's nothing in the poem about the Jewish people. Am Yisrael, Bnei Yisrael, none of that appears in this particular poem. Nevertheless, there are those that believe that this poem is basically written in thanksgiving for a geula of the Jewish nation, a redemption of the Jewish nation. Which redemption? There are 3 different opinions. The first one is the Sephardic opinion. The Sfardim, Edot Mizrach, recite this poem on Pesach, and on Chol HaMoed Pesach. And because of that, they're reciting it because they believe that this poem is talking about Yetziat Mitzrayim. And in Yetziat Mitzrayim, we went through the sea, right? We went through the desert. We were cured from illness, from our being oppression. And of course, we had been jailed, so all four of the things are talking about what happened in Egypt. Okay. The next opinion is that King David didn't write the poem. The poem was written by an anonymous poet when the Jews returned. Rivka? When the Jews, I thought it was a good throw. Okay. When the Jews returned from Bavel. So this was written in the 6th century BCE. And you'll see in verse Gimel in a minute, we haven't even read a verse yet, Rivka. So we'll see in a minute why that one makes sense. And then there's a third opinion that it was written by David HaMelech, but it's not talking about Egypt. It's not talking about Ole Bavel, Shivat Zion, the return from Bavel and the building of the Second Temple. It's talking about Latid Lavo, the final future redemption of the Jewish people. Okay, so so far that's 4 opinions, right? The last opinion is that of the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov, Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov, who of course died in 1750 and is the founder of the Hasidic movement, he began a custom that most Hasidim still do, to recite this poem at Mincha on Friday, Erev Shabbat, Mincha Erev Shabbat, to recite this poem. And even though it's not my custom, it's a beautiful custom. And all of the bad stuff that's happening in the poem that God saved us from, that's how weak. That the real salvation is God got us through the 6 days of Malacha and brought us to another Shabbat. So that the Geula that the poem is talking about is Shabbat, is Menuchat Shabbat, the rest, the Shalva, the sense of peace that we have on Shabbat. And a lot of Hasidim, I love to learn the Sfat Emet, and you see it a lot, especially in the Sfat Emet, the Gera, but other Hasidim really view Shabbat as an island in the storm, that their lives in the 1700s, 1800s, in Eastern Europe, their lives were miserable. Generally speaking, I know we know a few rich people, but 99% of the population was suffering in Eastern Europe. And on Shabbat, they could feel like kings. So that what the Baal Shem Tov is saying is that when you get to the threshold of Shabbat, you should have this sense of, I was saved from terrible adversity, because that's what each week in their lives was, terrible adversity. So those are the basically 5 opinions. We're going to sort of see another opinion when we get to verse 23, assuming we get to verse 23 today. But okay, but let's begin. The poem begins with a very short introduction. That's a verse that we've seen many times already. Hodu Lashem ki tov, give thanks to Hashem because Hashem is good. Ki la'olam chasdo, and his chesed, the kindness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the beneficent nature of God, is eternal. And by eternal, we mean it in 2 ways. It's both all the time and everywhere. The term olam is discussing both spatially and temporally. Ad olam means forever, and ha-olam is the world. So when we say la-olam, we mean both all the time and everywhere. And so this praising introduction goes on, verse bet, Yomru Gu'ule Hashem, that those who have been redeemed by God. Now, who is this group that's been redeemed by God? Well, I just gave you 5 opinions. One opinion is it's the 4 victims in the poem. One opinion is it was Egypt. One opinion is it was Bavel. One opinion is it's in the future. One opinion is getting through the week. So, okay, whoever these people who have been redeemed, Asher Ga'alam Miyad Sar, who have been redeemed out of the hand of Tsar. Tsar means difficulty, oppression, tsaris, But for the Jews in Eastern Europe, this was a pun, because who was the one that oppressed them? The Tsar. So Tsar here is said, semi-jokingly, is a reference to the Tsar of the Russian Empire, because in the 1700s and 1800s, almost all of the Hasidim lived under the Russian rule. Remember, Poland was part of Russia until World War I. And Poland was where most of the Hasidim were living. There were some Hasidim that were in Hungary, Romania. Those weren't under the Tsar. They were under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and they didn't they didn't have it as bad. They didn't have it as bad because Franz Josef was a Judeophile. But most of the Hasidim were in Russia, and they had it bad. And the Tsar was just, it's like Fiddler on the Roof, May God bless and keep the Tsar far away from us, right? That's the pun, okay? Gimel, Umei Aratzot Kibtzam, and from the lands of their kibbutz, collective, from the lands that they became part of, that they got collected into, gathered into. And where are those lands? Mizrach, Marav, Safon, Yam. They are east, west, north, and now it doesn't say south. It says the sea. So the sea is viewed as its own direction. Why? Especially if this was written by King David. Why would the sea be the south? We usually call the sea the west because of the Mediterranean. Yama, right? It means westward, and that's the sea. But think about the times of King David and King Solomon. Where were the first Jewish sailors sailing from? Etzion Gever, Eilat. So Yam for them was often south. King Solomon especially, the navy that he had was going from Eilat to Africa and brought back many goodies and a wife and like Queen of Sheba, right, who was of course Ethiopian, but they brought back treasures, gold and especially ivory was brought from the south. So Yam for them meant the Red Sea, Yam Suf, and that's one of the reasons why it says sea instead of south. Okay, so this is just an introduction. But again, there's 4 items there because 4 is the flavor of the month in this particular poem. And if you look at verses Vav, Yud Gimel, Yud Tet, and Chav Chet, you can tell them because they're highlighted or bolded. Those 4 lines are basically the same. We're going to see a very slight difference. For each one of the 4 difficulties, there is a line about calling out to God. And for each one of them, Chet, Tet Vav, Chaf Aleph, and on the next page, Lamed Aleph, there's a verse of Yodu Lashem Chasto, of thanksgiving. So we've got 4 troubles, 4 prayers, and 4 thanksgivings. So that's why when we say in this verse here, east, west, north, south, okay, we already see that the poem is going to focus on 4 different types of troubles. Because the Jewish troubles are the 4 points of the compass. They're everywhere. They're all over wherever we go. And so now we're going to actually start the body of the poem. And the body of the poem has two parts. The first part of the poem has four parts, and it goes from verse Dalet, verse 4, to verse Lamed Bet on page 2. And those are the four difficulties, and that's what we're going to be concentrating on today. And then the next section, Lamed Gimel through Mem Aleph, is more theological or philosophic about the causes of sarot, of problems and difficulties in life. And we'll Bezrat Hashem, we'll do that next week. Okay, so let's begin. The first one, right away, Ta'u Bamidbar. You were wandering. Ta'u comes the word like for mistake, wandering. You were floundering, if you will, in the desert. And this was something that was always considered very, very difficult. Israel, we know, is on the edge of a number of deserts. The Sinai, the Jordan is all desert. After you go about 5 miles into Jordan, the rest of the country is desert. So we're surrounded by deserts, and getting lost in the desert was a real problem for people living in Eretz Yisrael. So generally, people got lost in the desert by mistake. It was because people traveled the desert in caravans. But if perhaps you missed your caravan, or the caravan left without you, or you couldn't keep up with the caravan because there was something about you that was slower, that's when you ended up being in this difficulty. Very few people on purpose went out into the desert, but it happened, sadly, relatively often. Ta'u bamidbar, you're wandering lost in the desert. Bishimon derech, in a road which is extremely dry, extremely difficult. Ir moshav lo matzau, and there is no city that can be found, no settlement available to you. Now, I'm translating midbar as desert, and that's really what is the normal understanding of it, but it really means a wilderness. For us in Eretz Yisrael, the wilderness means the desert. The world is, according to Chazal, is separated into 3 different sections. There is Yishuv, where people live, cities, towns, okay? There is Midbar, places where it's very difficult to live. For us, that means desert, but it could mean a jungle. It could mean Antarctica, the polar caps. It could mean mountains, places where it's very, very difficult to live. And the third part of the world is Yam, is ocean. So that's why Chazal viewed geography, okay? So here, it's wilderness. Yeshimon is a reference to dryness. So we know that the wilderness we're talking about is desert, okay? Re'evim gam tzemeim. They're hungry and also thirsty. Now we know thirst is worse than hunger. You can go, most people can go a week, 10 days without food. But most people can't go 2 days without water. I mean, there are stories of people that have made it longer, but basically you die of thirst way before you die of hunger. Nafsham bahem titataf. The soul, the life force within them is chalashing, is fainting away, is the most popular translation for titataf. Their soul is just pining away. It's just becoming so weak that the person can't go on. Then what happens? Vayitzaku el Hashem b'tzar lahem, and they cry out to God out of their tsar. Their tsaris, the thing that is afflicting them, mimitzukotehem yatzilem, and from their difficulty, yatzilem, God saves them. So this is making it through the desert, making it through the wilderness. You cry out to God, and X percentage of those that cry out to God are saved. And if you're in that category, then Zion, v'yadrichem b'derech yeshara, and God guides them. So the wandering in the desert is solved by yadrichem, guidance in the right way. Now you can see why this might also be a metaphor for life, that people start to flounder in their own lives, and that HaKadosh Baruch Hu helps them to find the right path. We all know people who in their personal lives are having difficulty finding their way, choosing a profession or just finding a job or whatever, or just floundering around. And so they cry to Hashem, v'yadrichem, they receive guidance, they get specifically put on the derech, on the right road, derech yeshara, and God guides them onto the straight path. Lo lechet el ir moshav, so that they can get out of the unsettled wilderness and arrive at a settlement, a place where there are people that can help them and can serve them. And then we get to verse chet, and again, verse chet is repeated over and over again 4 times. Yodu l'Hashem chasdo. These people are obligated to do what? Give thanks to Hashem for his kindness, v'nifla'otav livnei adam, and God's wonders, miracles, they have to make known to other people. In other words, there's an obligation to make known publicly their thanksgiving to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In the time of the temple, that meant bringing a korban todah. Nowadays, that means benching gomel publicly. We bench gomel in a minyan. And preferably, by the way, within 3 days of whatever it was, whether it was traffic accident or, God forbid, a disease, you get out of the hospital, okay? Whatever it might be, within 3 days. Ki, hisbia nefesh shokeka, because God gave sovea, v'yachalta v'savata, gave sufficiency to a thirsting soul, a soul, v'nefesh re'eva milei tov, and a hungry soul is filled with good. And that's the first of the 4. The first of the 4 is crossing the desert without a wilderness and surviving the problem, and that's that. Before we do the second one, there's a little bit of an issue, and again, this is not a halachic shir, but I just want to mention. It really seems from here that crossing the desert doesn't necessarily demand that you say the bracha or bring a korban. It seems that crossing the desert in adversity requires it. And for that reason, I know a lot of people say tefillat, bench gomel after flying over the ocean, and that's going to be later in the poem. But again, it seems like you only say it if something went wrong. If the flight was good, or if the trip across the desert went like clockwork, you're with the caravan, you got to all of the stops for watering on time, and everything went smoothly, I personally don't believe that you're required to say the bracha. And therefore, when I just flew back from the States, I didn't bench gomel over flying over the ocean, because at no time did I really feel, in any jeopardy, in any danger. And it seems like the context of the poem that the benching gomel is based on means that there had to be some calamity, or at least some distress. That seems to be, but anyways, what I'm saying is controversial. It was the opinion of Rabbi Soloveitchik, but a lot of people do indeed say it, and I don't want to say that they're wrong. But when you read the poem, it seems like the opinion of Rabbi Soloveitchik seems to be the true one, that you were really in difficulty. Okay? Let's go to the next one. And the next one we can also put in a modern perspective as well in a minute. Okay, Yud. Yoshe Choshech V'Tzalmovet. Those dwelling in darkness and the shadow of death. Who's that talking about? What? No. Asirei Ane Ubarzel. Those who are, right, those who are bound up in affliction and iron. What are these people? In jail. These are people who have been jailed. And again, the same idea that I mentioned a moment ago. I mean, whenever, Bernie Madoff gets out of jail, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, he can stay there for a long time. But if he ever gets out of jail, I'm not sure he has to say the bracha. Because I'd like to think there are no other Jews in jail, but unfortunately there are. There are. The upstate New York happens to have a prison that has minyanim and has glatt kosher food. Okay, whatever. But I don't think you necessarily have to say this bracha when you get out of jail in the United States today.
How about in Israel?
I think in the United States too. Yeah, I think in Israel too. Now, when you're in a jail that treats you humanely, and you were never in, darkness and dungeon and despair, I'm not sure you have to say the poem. You have to say the bracha. This was talking about historically. When Jews were thrown into jail, it was rare that they ever got out. We have terrible, terrible stories about Rabbanim, the Maharal, the Maharam Rottenberg spent the last 7 years of his life in prison. Rabbi Meir of Rottenberg. Okay? These are terrible in the 1290s. These are terrible, terrible times. And prisons with dungeons and torture and starvation. And if you got out, you really said a bracha. And that was true of the Tsarist prisons in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries as well. Okay? So, again, keeping it into that, in that context. Ki himru imre kale. Okay? Because they went against the sayings of God. Now, I don't want to deal with this right now. It makes it sound like the person who was in jail deserved it because they somehow had rebelled against Hashem. But I want to deal with that problem next week. Now, do the people that have these sorot, did they earn them? Were they deserving of them? I'm going to leave that in abeyance for next week. The atzat elyon na'atsu, and they scorned the advice, the teachings of heaven, elyon, on high. So in other words, they were in jail because they did something wrong. But again, whether or not they deserve, I just want to leave that for next week. We'll come to it. Okay? But Yud-Bet goes again back to their suffering. Vayachna ba'amel libam. And they gave up because of the affliction, because of the terrible depression of their hearts. Koshlu ve'ein ozer. They were nikashel, they were falling and they were failing without any help. So in other words, they came to the pit of despair, and then they yizaku el Hashem. Then we go back to Yud Gimel. They cried out to Hashem, and Hashem saves them. I just want to say one famous story, and I don't know if it's true, but there's a famous story about a Hasid that was imprisoned in Tsarist Russia in the 1800s, and every day he was woken up by his guards and he was put in a room, and in the room there was a crank, and like a handle, and he turned the crank all day long. Whatever it was, 8 hours, 12 hours, whatever it was, all day long. And then they put him back in his cell to sleep. And, and that was every day. And after he was in prison for a long time, and for some reason he got permission to leave, he went to the jailers and he said, please, it's many years that I've been doing this. Could I see what I was doing? And he went into the next room, and all there was the end of the crank and a weight. He was doing nothing. He was just being tortured, and it accomplished absolutely nothing. And then in despair, he said, this makes me feel worse than all my time in jail. The idea that you're absolutely doing nothing, and this story is told about, it's during the Haggadah, is where this Hasidic story is placed, because the Jews quite often did avodat farech. They did work that broke not only their backs, but also their spirit, because it wasn't something that was really accomplishing anything. And that's like the worst of all. And apparently that's the kind of idea that verse 12 is referring to, that he was really brought low by just the torture and the unfairness of it. It was just, there was nothing redeeming about it. There's nothing redeeming about it. If he, at least if he had made license plates, he would have thought, like, remember the old days, the prisoners used to make license plates. At least if he did something constructive. By the way, in jails today, quite often you can earn money because you can do work that ends up being sold to companies. In Texas, the prison system actually makes money because they use the prisoners as workers, and the prisoners themselves can put money away while they're in jail. And so you don't have that same sense of despair that's referred to in verse Yud Bet. Okay? Now we're at verse Yud Gimel, which is again bold. And it's almost the same verse Vav. And there's an argument about the differences. If you notice, the first word in Vav is Yitzaku, Tza'aka, and here it's Vayizaku, Za'aka. They both mean to cry out. But is there a difference in the kind of cry from being in the desert and from being in jail? Some people say yes, that Za'ak is louder. That's why, and because when you make that cry, it might be heard by someone, as opposed to Tza'ak, which is a quieter cry, because in the desert, the odds are nobody's going to hear it. And if you notice at the end of the verse, one says Yatzilem, and then it's Yoshiem. What's the difference between Yatzilem and Yoshiem? Exactly. When we say, Ana Hashem Hoshiana, please God save us, that's talking spiritually. When someone is saved physically, it's Hatzalah, which is why the ambulance corps is called Hatzalah. And why, if you go to the beaches in Israel, the lifeguards, Matzil, it says on their t-shirt, right? That's to save you physically. So in other words, from the desert is considered more of a physical salvation, and in jail it's considered more of a spiritual salvation. That's what I think makes sense. Although I saw a couple of Meforshim that said it's just poetic style, and the verses really mean the exact same thing. And that really the changing in the terminology means both happened in both circumstances. I don't know what the right answer is. I'd like to think that there's a slight difference in the circumstances, but they're going to get repeated, and we'll try to apply them. Try to apply them to the different circumstances. But again, cried out to God in the difficulty that was upon them, and God saved them from the mitzukoteim, from their terrible burdens, from their terrible situation. And the word that describes the salvation in verse 7 was guidance to find the right road. Here it is, Yotzi'aim, was to be let out, egress, to get out. So in other words, this dafka, specific word in each case for what was the nature of their salvation. Here it is, Yitzi'ah, which is egress, exit. Michoshech v'tzalmavet, these people got out of darkness and shadow of death. Umosrotehem yinatek, and their oppressions were ended, and their torture was stopped. And again, Tedvav is a repetition of Chet. Each one of the four has this. Yodu Lashem Chazdo. You're obligated to thank Hashem for his kindness, and do it before humans publicly. So again, it gets repeated. And now, what is he thanking for? Ted Zion, the end of the second set. Ki shibar daltot nechoshet, because God broke the bronze or copper doors, bronze probably, ubriche barzel gidea, and tore asunder the locks, bolts of iron. A briach, when you see a gate to a city and there's a bar in the back. Right. And that's where they took the name. Right, that's the name. The lock company, Rabbi, took it from this. I don't know the English. Is it a bolt? I'm not sure what the word is.
They come out of the door. You got little
Yeah. But that tremendous bar that was on the back of a gate to a city, that's a bria. Is there an English word? There must be an English word for that. It's called a bolt. Okay, fine. So in other words, so God, broke, the bronze doors and broke the iron or steel bolt that was holding it in place. So that's 2 out of the 4. Okay. Next. Evilim miderech pisham. Again, I'm going to leave some of the theological. Those who sinned in the path of their iniquity, ume'avonoteim yit'anu, and were afflicted from their sins. Okay, so in other words, we're saying here that verse Yudchet, Kol ochel tita'ev nafsham, anyone who, whenever they eat, it afflicts their soul, v'yagia ad sharimad, and they find themselves approaching the gates of death. Those are sick people. But again, we're saying in this one, like we said in the second one, that somehow their affliction, in this case disease, was a result of their own iniquity. I want to discuss the philosophy and theology of that next week, but we didn't see it in the first one in the desert. We saw it in the people that went to jail, and we see it in the people that become sick, that we believe that somehow they deserved it. And that's always difficult to say, and we'll discuss it more fully next week, because I just want to get through the cases this week. And again, they came to this place where it's interesting that the way they describe disease as